The warning klaxon screamed through the maximum security wing of Station Oryx 7, a deafening rhythmic pulse that bathed the corridor in nauseating red light. Jack Silas stood his ground, the magnetic soles of his boots locked onto the vibrating deck plating, his knuckles white as he gripped a stolen pulse rifle that was overheating in his hands. In front of him, blocking the only exit, stood the station's elite liquidation squad, 12 armored enforcers, their thermal lances humming with lethal charge, ready to incinerate everything in Sector 4. Behind him, breathing heavily in the dark, was the asset. They called her a monster, a Void-Stalker, a mindless beast that would devour anyone foolish enough to get close. They were wrong. As the squad captain raised his weapon to fire, a massive obsidian hand reached out from the shadows, gently moving Jax aside as if he were made of glass. Vraka, the matriarch of the Void, stepped into the light. She wasn't cowering. Her scales, once dull and broken, now glowed with a terrifying, blinding violet luminescence that crackled with psionic energy. She looked down at Jax, the lowly human janitor who was the only being in the galaxy stupid enough to show her kindness, and let out a subsonic roar that shattered the reinforced glass of the containment cells. They had come to execute a prisoner. Instead, they had cornered a queen, and she was done letting them hurt her human. Station Oryx 7 didn't just smell like a prison. It smelled like the slow, grinding death of hope. The air was a recycled soup of ozone, unwashed bodies, and the copper tang of dried blood that lived permanently in the back of Jax Silas's throat. For 3 years, this floating rust bucket in the asteroid belt had been his purgatory. Once a decorated combat medic for the Terran Coalition, Jax had been stripped of his rank, his pension, and his honor for refusing to let a prisoner of war bleed out during the Lyran uprising. The court-martial had been swift, and his exile absolute. Now, he was a beastkeeper, the lowest rung on the station's ladder. His days were a mindless, brutal loop of hosing down vomit in the drunk tanks and hauling buckets of synthetic slop to the exotics, creatures kidnapped from across the galaxy to fight in Krell's illegal gladiatorial arena. Jax moved through the corridors like a ghost, his grey eyes dead to the cruelty around him. He spoke to no one. He trusted no one. He simply existed, eating tasteless protein paste and sleeping in a closet-sized hab unit where the hum of the ventilation fans sounded like the screams of the men he had failed to save. But Jax's silence wasn't just apathy. It was a shield built from trauma. 6 months ago, he had tried to save another creature. Unit 734. A gentle telepathic herbivore that Krell had slated for the meat grinder. Jax had tried to sneak it extra rations, tried to ease its pain with stolen meds. He had gotten careless. Krell found out. Jax didn't get fired. He was forced to watch as Krell personally executed the creature in the pit, laughing the entire time. That night, something inside Jax had withered and died. He vowed never to get attached again, never to look them in the eye, never to be the hero. He was just a janitor in a slaughterhouse, and his only job was to survive until the station eventually fell apart or the vacuum of space claimed him. The monotony of his misery broke on a Tuesday, heralded by the bone-shaking thrum of a heavy containment hauler docking at Bay 4. It took 20 guards armed with high-voltage shock pikes to drag the containment pod into the maximum security wing. The station buzzed with the news. Krell had acquired a Void-Stalker Matriarch. They were the legends of the Outer Rim, 8 feet of obsidian scales and muscle, capable of phasing through shadows and tearing through hull plating with bare claws. When Jax was assigned the graveyard shift to monitor the new asset, he expected to find a raging beast throwing itself against the walls. What he found was a statue. Vraka sat in the center of the damp, cold cell, bound by heavy gravity chains that pinned her limbs to the floor. She was starving, her ribs visible beneath her armored plating, and her violet eyes were clouded with pain. But she wasn't screaming. She was watching. She watched the patrol patterns of the drones. She watched the flickering shield grid. And most unnervingly, she watched Jax with an intelligence that terrified him. The cruelty of the station's owner, Krell, was absolute. He didn't just want her to fight, he wanted her broken. 2 days after her arrival, Krell entered the containment block with his entourage, holding a bucket of fresh meat. Jack stood at attention by the door, his heart hammering, keeping his eyes fixed on the floor. Krell taunted the matriarch, holding the meat just outside the laser grid, letting the scent waft in. Vraka didn't move, her dignity unassailable even in chains. "Look at it," Krell sneered, kicking the glass. "It thinks it's royalty. Starve it for another week. I want it crawling for scraps before the match." He turned to Jax, his eyes cold and predatory. "And you, janitor? If I see even a crumb of food in there, I'll throw you in the cage with her. Understand?" Jax swallowed the bile rising in his throat. "Yes, sir," he said flatly, masking the rage boiling in his veins. He watched Krell leave, then looked back at Vraka. She hadn't looked at the meat. She was looking at him, as if she knew exactly what it cost him to stay silent. For 4 nights, Jax stood outside the force field, listening to the silence of her suffering. He saw the way her massive chest hitched with shallow, labored breaths. He saw the tremors in her 4 clawed hands. On the 5th night, the memory of Unit 734 came flooding back. The guilt, the helplessness. Jax realized he couldn't do it again. He couldn't be the man who watched. The medic in him, buried under years of cynicism, clawed its way to the surface. He disabled the audio sensors in the corridor, a crime punishable by airlocking. His hands shook as he retrieved a canister of high-grade nutrient gel and a med stim he'd swiped from the infirmary. He approached the laser grid. He knew the warnings. Void-Stalkers feel no gratitude. They only feel hunger. But looking into the abyss of her eyes, he didn't see a monster. He saw a prisoner of war who had been abandoned by the universe, just like him. Jax punched in the override code, and the laser grid flickered and died. The hum of the force field vanished, leaving nothing between the fragile human and the deadliest predator in the sector but 3 feet of cold, concrete floor. The change in the room was physical, a sudden drop in pressure that popped Jax's ears. Vraka shifted, the heavy gravity chains clanking ominously against the floor. She didn't lunge. She didn't roar. She simply turned her massive, triangular head toward him, her violet eyes narrowing into vertical slits. Jax froze, the nutrient canister slick with sweat in his grip. The smell of her was overpowering, a mix of ozone, deep space cold, and something floral, like crushed night-blooming jasmine. "I'm not going to hurt you," Jax whispered, his voice cracking. He felt ridiculous speaking to a giant alien, but he needed to ground himself. He slowly slid the canister across the floor. It stopped inches from her clawed hand. Vraka looked at the food, then at Jax's exposed throat. The tension stretched for an agonizing minute. Then, with a movement almost too fast to track, she snatched the canister. She didn't tear it open. She popped the seal with a delicate click of a claw and drank. When she finished, she didn't retreat. She pushed the empty canister back toward him. An exchange, a transaction. The next night, Jax returned. But food wasn't enough to bridge the gap between species. He needed her to understand he wasn't just a servant. He sat on the floor just outside her reach, and in the layer of dust on the concrete, he drew a crude map of the station, pointing to her cell and then to the hangar bay. He tapped his chest, then the hangar. Escape. Vraka watched him, her head tilted. Slowly, she extended a long, obsidian finger. She didn't strike. She reached past the map and drew a circle in the dust, then 3 smaller dots around it. She tapped the dots, then her chest. Family. Brood. She looked at Jax, her expression devastatingly sad. She wasn't just a warrior. She was a mother who had been stolen from her kin. Jax felt a lump in his throat. He reached out and drew a line connecting her circle to his stick figure self. "I will help you." Vraka let out a soft, chuffing sound, her bioluminescence pulsing a warm, soft blue. It was the first time the darkness in the cell felt like a sanctuary. But their secret was nearly exposed on the 10th night. Jax was inside the cell, applying a numbing gel to the raw skin under her cuffs, when the corridor lights flashed amber, a surprise patrol. There was no time to run. If he stepped out, the sensors would catch him. Hide. Vraka didn't speak the word. She projected the intent directly into his skull. Jax froze. There was nowhere to hide in the bare cell. Vraka shifted, lifting her massive armored wing. It was an act of impossible trust. Jax scrambled underneath the obsidian appendage, curling into a ball against her side. He was pressed against her ribcage, enveloped in her scent and heat. He could hear the thundering rhythm of her twin hearts. Outside, the heavy boots of the guards clanked past. One shined a light into the cell. Vraka snarled, a feral, convincing sound of aggression that made the guard laugh and keep walking. "Feisty tonight," the guard muttered. Under her wing, Jax held his breath, realizing that the most dangerous creature on the station was currently acting as his shield. When the guards left, the bond changed. It wasn't just transactional anymore. Jax emerged from beneath her wing, but Vraka didn't pull away. She looked at the bruises on Jax's face, fresh ones from a run-in with her drunk supervisor. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and touched the bruise with a claw tip. She began to vibrate, a deep, resonant thrumming that shook the floor. It was a purr, but it was more than sound. It was a resonance frequency that rattled Jax's bones and soothed the ache in his muscles. As she purred, images bled into his mind, not of war, but of gratitude, of safety. She pressed her forehead against his chest, right over his heart. A surge of golden warmth flooded his system, chasing away the cold that had lived in him for years. It was a soul marking. In the eyes of the Void, he was no longer an outsider. He was Pac. He was hers. She curled her massive body around him, creating a protective wall of obsidian scales between him and the door. For the first time in 3 years, Jax slept without nightmares, guarded by the monster everyone else feared. The peace of the cell was shattered 3 days later. Jax arrived for his shift to find the containment wing buzzing with activity. The cell was empty. A work order pinned to the glass read, "Subject to arena immediately. Combat mode, deathmatch." Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. They had moved the schedule up. Krell wasn't planning a fair fight. He was planning a massacre to boost ratings. Jax sprinted through the labyrinthine corridors, ignoring the checkpoints, ignoring the shouting guards. He reached the observation deck just as the arena lights flooded the pit. Below, Vraka stood in the center of the white sand, chained again. But she wasn't facing a gladiator. She was surrounded by 4 meat grinder droids, cybernetic horrors equipped with spinning buzzsaws and flamethrowers. The crowd roared for blood. Krell's voice boomed over the speakers, mocking the helpless beast. Jax saw Vraka look up. She wasn't looking at the droids. She was scanning the crowd, frantically looking for him. When she didn't see him, her shoulders slumped. She thought he had abandoned her. That look of betrayal broke something in Jax. He drew his stolen pulse rifle and shot the lock off the maintenance hatch leading to the pit. He wasn't a spectator today. He was a combatant. Jax hit the sand rolling just as the first droid engaged its flamethrower. "Vraka!" he screamed. The sound of his voice snapped her head around. Her eyes flared with recognition, then terror as she saw him running into the kill zone. Jax opened fire on the nearest droid, blowing out its sensory array. "Get the chains off!" he yelled, throwing her a magnetic key he'd swiped from security. Vraka caught it, snapping the locks in seconds. But the fight was rigged. The droids were shielded. One droid flanked them, its buzzsaw screaming. Vraka lunged to intercept it, but another droid caught her with a high-voltage tether, pinning her to the ground. She roared in agony as the electricity fried her nervous system. She was losing. The crowd cheered as the droids closed in to dismember her. Krell laughed over the intercom. "Finish her!" Jax saw the primary droid aiming a plasma cannon at Vraka's exposed throat. She was paralyzed by the shock tether, unable to move. Jax didn't calculate. He didn't think about survival. He sprinted across the sand and threw himself in the path of the beam. The impact was like being hit by a freight train. The plasma burned through his tactical vest, searing his shoulder and chest, throwing him 10 feet backward. He hit the sand hard, the smell of his own burning flesh filling his nose. The world went grey. He couldn't breathe. Through his fading vision, he saw Vraka freeze. She saw him fall. She saw the smoke rising from his chest. Her pupils dilated until her eyes were black pools of void. The bioluminescence on her skin turned from a soft blue to a violent, burning white. This was the berserker state, a biological overdrive that few survived witnessing. She didn't scream. She went silent. The tether holding her snapped like thread. With a burst of speed that cracked the arena floor, she dismantled the droids. She didn't just break them, she atomized them. She ripped the arm off one unit and drove it through the chassis of another. She tore the head off the flamethrower unit and crushed it into scrap. Then, she turned her gaze to the observation deck. She leaped 30 feet into the air, digging her claws into the reinforced glass. The barrier shattered. Krell's laughter died in his throat as the matriarch dragged him out of his VIP box and threw him into the pit. The arena erupted in chaos. But Vraka didn't chase the fleeing guards. She dropped back down to the sand, ignoring the explosions, and scooped Jax's limp body into her arms. She curled around him like a dragon guarding its hoard, roaring a challenge at the collapsing station. She wasn't leaving without him. Consciousness returned to Jax in waves of agonizing heat. He wasn't in a med bay. He was in the cockpit of a stolen long-range shuttle, drifting in the silence of deep space. He tried to sit up, gasping as his chest pulled tight. He looked down and saw his wound wasn't bandaged. It was sealed with a shimmering organic resin that glowed faintly. Vraka sat at the pilot's console, her massive frame hunched over. She looked grey, her scales dull, her movements sluggish. She had given up a massive amount of her own bioenergy to seal his wound, draining her life force to save his. She turned at the sound of his breath. She moved to him, kneeling beside the co-pilot seat. Her hand, large enough to crush his skull, cupped his face with infinite gentleness. "You broke for me," she spoke, the words clumsy, her vocal cords forcing themselves to shape human speech for the first time. Jax leaned into her touch, tears pricking his eyes. "I'd do it again," he rasped. They traveled for weeks, guided by Vraka's instincts, until they reached the coordinates of her home. The shuttle descended through a violet atmosphere, landing on a crystalline plateau. Jax stumbled out, weak but alive, supporting Vraka, who was still recovering. Immediately, they were surrounded. Dozens of Void-Stalkers emerged from the shadows, their weapons raised, their bioluminescence flashing red, the color of war. They saw the human. They hissed, spears leveled at Jax's heart. He froze, realizing he might have just delivered himself to his execution. But Vraka stepped in front of him. She roared, a sound of absolute authority, and flared her scales. She pointed to the soul mark on Jax's chest. She spoke to her kin in a flurry of clicks and hums. The red lights of the warriors faded to blue. They lowered their weapons. They bowed, not to her, but to them. Vraka turned to Jax, her strength returning in the atmosphere of her homeworld. She wrapped her massive arms around him, pulling him against her plated chest. The fear of the last 3 years finally evaporated from Jax's soul. He looked at the alien sky, then at the woman, the queen, who held him. He had spent his life being discarded by his own kind, punished for his compassion. But here, amidst the monsters of the outer rim, he had found a loyalty deeper than blood. He wasn't a keeper anymore. He wasn't a janitor. He was the consort of the matriarch. As the twin moons rose over the valley, Jax realized that they were right about the cage. It did kill the man he used to be, but the man who walked out of the fire was something far stronger, and he was finally home. They told him the beast would devour him if he got too close. They never warned him that she would love him enough to burn the universe down to keep him safe.